The day started like any other for the flight attendant. She had been working in the airline industry for nearly a decade, and she knew the ins and outs of her job better than anyone else on the team. Her friends often joked that she could handle anything: rowdy passengers, last-minute schedule changes, even turbulence that made grown adults grip their armrests in panic. But today was going to be different. Little did she know this would be the kind of day people talk about for years. It was early morning when she arrived at the airport, her uniform pressed neatly, her hair tied back in a tidy bun. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel mixed with coffee from the nearby cafe, a scent she'd grown oddly fond of over the years. As she walked through the terminal, she exchanged quick greetings with coworkers, pilots heading to briefings, ground staff rushing around with luggage carts, and fellow attendants reviewing passenger manifests. Everything seemed normal, routine, even. That sense of calm wouldn't last long. Her assignment for the day: first-class service on one of the airline's most luxurious routes. This particular flight catered to high-profile passengers, business tycoons, celebrities, and sometimes even tech moguls who traveled in style. It wasn't unusual for her to encounter famous faces, but she never treated them differently. To her, everyone boarding the plane was simply a passenger, no matter how much money they had or how many headlines they made. As boarding began, she stood near the entrance of the aircraft, greeting each traveler with a warm smile and a polite, "Welcome aboard." Most passengers nodded politely or gave a quick thank you before finding their seats. Then came the moment that would change everything. Two figures appeared at the top of the jet bridge, instantly recognizable despite their casual attire. One was a tall man with an air of confidence, his face familiar from countless magazine covers and news articles. The other, a younger version of him, looked equally unbothered, scrolling through his phone as if the world revolved around whatever was on the screen. The older man was none other than the billionaire entrepreneur whose name dominated conversations about innovation and space exploration. His presence alone commanded attention, and whispers rippled through the cabin as he moved toward his seat. The younger man followed closely behind, exuding the same nonchalant attitude. They settled into their first-class seats without so much as a glance at the flight attendant waiting to assist them. She approached them with her usual professionalism, offering a cheerful greeting and asking if they needed anything before takeoff. The response, or lack thereof, was telling. The entrepreneur barely acknowledged her, giving a curt nod while continuing to chat with his son. Something about their demeanor set off alarm bells in her mind. It wasn't just arrogance, it was a sense of entitlement, as though the rules didn't apply to them. And unfortunately, her instincts were about to prove correct. From the moment they sat down, small issues began cropping up. The entrepreneur asked for something outside the standard menu options, dismissing the explanation that certain items weren't available. When reminded of safety protocols during pre-flight checks, he rolled his eyes dramatically, muttering under his breath about how inconvenient it all was. Meanwhile, his son cranked up the volume on his headphones, the faint sound of music leaking out and disturbing nearby passengers trying to relax. At first, she tried to brush it off, focusing instead on ensuring the rest of the cabin felt comfortable. But as the minutes ticked by, the disruptions grew harder to ignore. Another passenger leaned over to whisper a complaint about the noise, and she nodded sympathetically, promising to address it. Taking a deep breath, she approached the pair once again, determined to maintain her composure. "Excuse me," she said softly, leaning down slightly to get their attention. "Could we please keep the volume down? We want to make sure everyone enjoys a peaceful flight." The younger man glanced up briefly, shrugged, and turned back to his device. The entrepreneur, however, fixed her with a piercing stare. "Are you serious right now?" he asked, his tone dripping with disbelief. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Her heart skipped a beat, but she held her ground. "I understand, sir, but these policies are in place for everyone's comfort," she replied firmly. "We appreciate your cooperation." For a moment, there was silence. Then, with a smirk that sent chills down her spine, he leaned back in his seat. "All right then," he said, his voice low but laced with challenge. "Let's see where this goes." And just like that, the stage was set for a confrontation neither of them could have predicted. What happened next would test not only her patience but also her belief in doing what was right no matter the cost. The tension in the cabin was palpable, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. The flight attendant took a step back, her mind racing as she processed what had just happened. She'd dealt with difficult passengers before, people who thought their money or status gave them the right to bend the rules. But this felt different. This wasn't just someone throwing their weight around. It was a direct challenge, almost as if he was daring her to push back. She decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was having a bad day. Maybe stress from work or life was making him act out. Whatever the reason, she reminded herself that her job wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was also about finding ways to de-escalate situations and keep everyone safe. So she smiled politely and said, "Thank you for understanding. If there's anything else I can do to make your flight more comfortable, please let me know." But instead of easing the tension, her words seemed to have the opposite effect. The entrepreneur raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Comfortable?" he repeated, his tone mocking. "You think turning my music down will make this flight comfortable? Let me tell you something. Comfort starts with respecting people's time and preferences." His son snickered beside him, adding fuel to the fire. A few nearby passengers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the growing friction. One older woman leaned over to whisper to her companion, "This isn't going to end, well?" The flight attendant felt her cheeks flush, but she forced herself to stay calm. Losing her temper wouldn't help anyone, least of all the other passengers counting on her to maintain order. Taking a deep breath, she tried one more time. "Sir, I'm here to ensure everyone has a pleasant experience. That includes following guidelines that apply to all travelers. I hope you can understand where I'm coming from." For a split second, it looked like he might relent. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, shaking his head. "Fine," he muttered, though his tone suggested anything but agreement. His son reluctantly lowered the volume on his headphones, still muttering under his breath. It wasn't a victory, but it was enough, for now. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the flight attendant focused on completing her pre-flight duties. She double-checked seatbelts, reviewed safety procedures with the passengers, and made sure everyone was ready for departure. Outwardly, she appeared composed, but inside, her nerves were frayed. Every glance toward the first-class section felt like walking a tightrope. Would they cause another scene? Was this really over? Or was it just the beginning? Once the plane was airborne, things seemed to settle into a rhythm. Passengers relaxed, some opening books or laptops, others drifting off to sleep. The hum of conversation filled the cabin, blending with the steady drone of the engines. For a while, it almost felt normal. Almost. Then came the next hurdle. About 30 minutes into the flight, the entrepreneur pressed the call button above his seat. When the flight attendant approached, he wasted no time getting to the point. "I need to bring my dog on board," he announced, reaching down to reveal a small carrier tucked under his seat. Inside was a tiny white dog, its eyes wide as it peered out at the world. She blinked, caught off guard. "Sir, I'm sorry, but pets aren't allowed in the cabin unless they're service animals," she explained gently. "There are strict regulations about this, and we have to follow them for health and safety reasons." He didn't even blink. "Regulations? You're telling me you expect me to leave my dog in cargo? Do you know how stressful that is for animals? Besides, this isn't some random pet. It's family." Her stomach tightened. She'd heard variations of this argument before, but never delivered with such authority. Still, the rules were clear. "I completely understand your concern, sir, but unfortunately exceptions can't be made. I'd be happy to assist you with arranging proper accommodations for future flights, though." His expression hardened. "You don't get it, do you? Rules are flexible when you're dealing with someone like me." The comment hit like a punch to the gut. Someone like him. The implication hung heavy in the air, dripping with entitlement. She clenched her fists briefly, fighting the urge to snap back. Instead, she chose her words carefully. With all due respect, sir, these policies exist to protect everyone on board. I'm afraid I can't allow the dog in the cabin." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched taut, broken only by the distant murmur of passengers chatting in the rows behind them. Then, without warning, he stood up, towering over her. "You've made your decision," he said coldly. "But trust me, you'll regret it." Before she could respond, he turned and strode toward the front of the plane, motioning for his son to follow. Confused murmurs rippled through the cabin as passengers watched the scene unfold. Some looked sympathetic, others amused, but most simply stared, unsure what to make of the escalating drama. The flight attendant's heart pounded as she returned to her station, replaying the confrontation in her mind. Had she done the right thing? Of course she had. The rules were black and white, and bending them for one passenger would set a dangerous precedent. But standing up to someone like him? That was something else entirely. Minutes later, the intercom crackled to life. "Attention, crew," came the pilot's voice. "We need to return to the gate immediately. Please prepare the cabin accordingly." A collective gasp swept through the passengers. Returning to the gate mid-flight was rare, and everyone knew it usually meant trouble. As the flight attendant began securing loose items and preparing for landing, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. Her decision had consequences, and they were about to become very real. The announcement about returning to the gate sent a ripple of confusion through the cabin. Passengers exchanged puzzled looks, whispering among themselves as they tried to piece together what was happening. Some glanced toward first class, where the entrepreneur and his son were now standing near the exit, their expressions unreadable. The flight attendant felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had a sinking feeling that this unexpected turn of events was somehow connected to her earlier confrontation. As the plane taxied back to the terminal, the atmosphere grew tense. People craned their necks to see what was going on, while others pulled out their phones to check for updates or send texts about the delay. A few passengers called out questions. "What's going on? Why are we stopping?" But the crew remained tight-lipped, following protocol and avoiding speculation. For the flight attendant, the silence was deafening. Every second felt like an eternity, each tick of the clock bringing her closer to whatever storm awaited them at the gate. When the aircraft finally came to a stop, the doors opened, and two uniformed security officers stepped aboard. Their presence instantly shifted the mood from curious to uneasy. They walked straight to the front of the plane, bypassing rows of bewildered travelers until they reached the entrepreneur and his son. Without hesitation, the officers gestured for the pair to gather their belongings and disembark. For a moment, it seemed like the entrepreneur might argue, his jaw tightening as he stared down the officers. But then, with a dismissive wave of his hand, he grabbed his bag and motioned for his son to follow. As they made their way down the aisle, the younger man shot a glare at the flight attendant, his expression filled with resentment. His father, however, didn't look at her at all. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed ahead, his posture radiating indignation. The other passengers watched in stunned silence as the duo exited the plane. Some clapped softly under their breath, clearly siding with the flight attendant, while others sat frozen, unsure how to react. Once the door closed behind them, the tension in the cabin began to ease slightly. Still, no one spoke much as the plane prepared to depart once again. Back in her seat near the galley, the flight attendant let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Part of her wanted to feel victorious. After all, she'd stood her ground and enforced the rules fairly. But another part of her couldn't shake the unease creeping into her thoughts. What would happen now? Had she crossed a line by kicking off someone so powerful? And why had the pilot decided to turn the plane around instead of simply continuing the flight? Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them particularly comforting. She'd heard stories about employees who clashed with high-profile individuals and faced serious repercussions afterward. Would she be reprimanded, or worse, fired for causing such a disruption? Or was this just standard procedure when dealing with unruly passengers, regardless of who they were? As the plane took off again, she did her best to focus on her duties, checking on passengers and ensuring everything ran smoothly. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the confrontation. She replayed every detail in her head. The entrepreneur's smug comments, the icy warning in his voice, the way his son had glared at her as if she'd ruined their day. It wasn't just anger she saw in their eyes. It was something deeper, almost predatory, like they knew something she didn't. By the time the flight landed at its destination, the incident had already started making waves. News outlets picked up fragments of the story, speculating about why a billionaire had been asked to leave a commercial flight. Social media buzzed with reactions, some praising the flight attendant for standing up to privilege, while others criticized her actions as overzealous or unnecessary. Reporters swarmed the terminal, eager to get statements from anyone involved. Caught in the chaos, the flight attendant hesitated before addressing the crowd. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the weight of everyone's attention made her palms sweat. But she knew she couldn't stay silent, not when her integrity was on the line. Standing tall despite her nerves, she gave a brief statement. "I believe in treating all passengers equally and ensuring safety and fairness for everyone on board. That's what I did today, and I stand by my decision." Her words earned scattered applause from bystanders, but the relief was short-lived. As she left the airport, her phone buzzed nonstop with notifications. Messages poured in from friends, family, and even strangers, most offering support, but some questioning whether she'd gone too far. Overwhelmed, she turned off her phone and allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. Little did she know, the real challenge was yet to come. When she reported to work the next morning, she found an email waiting for her, a summons to meet with the airline's executives immediately. Her stomach churned as she read the subject line. This wasn't just about explaining her side of the story anymore. It was about facing the consequences of crossing paths with someone who held immense power. Walking into the meeting room, she braced herself for whatever lay ahead. The executives greeted her with polite smiles, but their body language told a different story. They wasted no time getting to the point. "We need to discuss yesterday's events," one of them said, placing a folder on the table. Inside were printouts of news articles, social media posts, and internal reports, all centered around the incident. The flight attendant listened carefully as they outlined the fallout. Angry calls from influential clients, negative press coverage, and concerns about damage to the airline's reputation. Then came the bombshell. "There's something you should know," another executive added cautiously. "The individual involved recently acquired a significant stake in our company. His influence extends beyond just being a passenger." Her heart sank. Suddenly everything clicked. The entitled behavior, the thinly veiled threats, the swift response from security. He hadn't just been flexing his wealth, he owned part of the very airline she worked for. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. No matter how justified her actions had been, she was now caught in a battle she couldn't possibly win. But as daunting as the situation seemed, she refused to back down completely. Instead, she took a deep breath and reminded herself of one simple truth. She had done what she believed was right. Whether that would be enough to save her job or her career remained to be seen. The room felt smaller than it had just moments ago. The flight attendant sat across from the executives, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. She could feel their eyes on her, studying her every move as if trying to gauge how much fight she still had left in her. The weight of their words hung heavy in the air. "He owns part of the airline." It wasn't just a revelation. It was a declaration of power, one that made her feel like a pawn in someone else's game. One of the executives cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "We understand your position," he began, though his tone suggested otherwise. "You were enforcing company policy, and we respect that. But you also need to understand the broader implications here. This isn't just about one passenger. It's about maintaining relationships with key stakeholders." She nodded slowly, absorbing the message behind his carefully chosen words. Stakeholders. That's what they called people who held significant influence over the company, people like the entrepreneur she'd kicked off the plane. To them, this wasn't a matter of right versus wrong or fairness versus privilege. It was business, plain and simple. And in business, certain rules, even the ones written down, could bend when enough pressure was applied. Another executive chimed in, softer, but no less firm. Look, we're not saying you did anything illegal or unethical, but these situations require discretion, tact. You acted quickly, which is commendable in some cases, but maybe not this time. Do you see where we're coming from? She wanted to argue, to defend herself and explain why bending the rules for someone like him would set a dangerous precedent. But she bit her tongue, knowing it wouldn't change their minds. They weren't asking for her perspective. They were laying out the consequences of her actions, and those consequences were clear. The airline couldn't afford to alienate someone with such deep pockets and even deeper connections. After a long pause, the first executive leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Here's the situation, as it stands. We've received feedback from multiple sources that this incident has caused considerable tension. There are calls for accountability, both internally and externally. So we have to make a decision. Her heart pounded harder with each word. Accountability. Wasn't that exactly what she'd been striving for? Holding passengers accountable to the same standards, regardless of who they were. But now, the tables had turned, and suddenly she was the one being held accountable for doing her job. We'd like to offer you two options, the second executive continued. Option 1, you can resign quietly citing personal reasons. We'll provide a positive reference and ensure there's no black mark on your record. Option 2, he hesitated briefly before finishing. We terminate your employment due to conduct unbecoming of an employee given the circumstances. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Termination. Just like that, years of dedication, hard work, and professionalism boiled down to a single choice. Leave with dignity or walk away labeled as difficult. Neither option felt fair, but she knew better than to expect fairness in a world where money often spoke louder than principles. For a moment, she considered fighting back. What if she went public with her side of the story? What if she exposed the hypocrisy of letting someone so powerful flout the rules while punishing those who tried to uphold them? But as tempting as it was, she realized the risks far outweighed the rewards. Going up against a billionaire, and the institution he partially owned, wasn't just risky. It was nearly impossible without burning every bridge in sight. Instead, she took a deep breath and forced herself to think clearly. This wasn't just about her pride or her career. It was about survival. If she chose to dig in her heels, she might lose everything. Her income, her reputation, even her ability to find another job in the industry. On the other hand, taking the quieter route meant walking away with at least some semblance of control over her narrative. I'll take option 1, she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. I'll resign. The executives exchanged glances, seemingly relieved that she hadn't put up more of a fight. One of them nodded approvingly. We appreciate your cooperation. As promised, we'll handle your departure discreetly and provide a strong recommendation should you pursue opportunities elsewhere. With that, the meeting ended. She stood up, thanked them politely, and walked out of the room, her legs feeling heavier with each step. Outside, the office buzzed with its usual energy, co-workers chatting and laughing as if nothing extraordinary had happened. To them, she was just another face in the crowd, a cog in the machine. Only she knew the truth. Her life had changed, forever in the span of a single flight. Over the next few days, she processed everything in waves. Anger bubbled up first, followed by frustration, then sadness. She replayed the incident in her mind, dissecting every interaction, every decision, wondering if there was something, anything, she could have done differently. But deep down, she knew she'd acted according to her values. She hadn't backed down because standing up for what was right mattered more to her than pleasing someone with a title or a bank account. Still, the reality of her situation weighed heavily on her. Without a job, bills started piling up faster than she'd anticipated. Friends offered support, but sympathy only went so far. She needed a plan, a way to turn this setback into something meaningful, and slowly an idea began to form. What if she shared her story? Not as a victim, but as a lesson. People were already talking about the incident online, debating whether she was a hero or a villain. Why not add her voice to the conversation? Not to vilify anyone, but to highlight the importance of integrity, fairness, and holding everyone to the same standards, regardless of status. She started small, writing down her thoughts in a journal. At first it was cathartic, a way to process her emotions and reflect on what had happened. But as the pages filled, she realized her words had potential. Her story wasn't just hers. It belonged to anyone who had ever felt powerless against authority or privilege. It was a reminder that courage came not from winning, but from standing firm in the face of adversity. Encouraged by friends and family, she decided to take the next step, turning her notes into a memoir. Writing it wasn't easy. Some days, memories felt too raw, too painful to revisit. Other days, doubt crept in, whispering that no one would care about her experience. But she pushed through, pouring her heart into every chapter. When the book was finally finished, she titled it simply, Above the Clouds. It wasn't just a nod to her years in aviation. It was a metaphor for rising above challenges, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. She self-published it initially, unsure how it would be received. But within weeks, the response was overwhelming. Readers connected with her honesty, her vulnerability, and her unwavering belief in doing the right thing. Media outlets picked up the story, inviting her to share her journey on podcasts, talk shows, and panels. Suddenly, she found herself thrust back into the spotlight, but this time on her own terms. People praised her resilience, calling her an inspiration for standing up to power and refusing to compromise her values. Through it all, she remained grounded, remembering why she'd started this journey in the first place. It wasn't about fame or revenge. It was about sparking conversations, challenging norms, and reminding others that even in the face of immense pressure, they too could choose integrity over convenience. Looking back, she realized something profound. Losing her job had been devastating, yes, but it had also freed her in ways she never expected. For the first time in years, she wasn't bound by corporate policies or afraid of rocking the boat. Instead, she was charting her own course, using her voice to advocate for fairness and accountability, not just in airlines, but in every corner of society. And as she stood on stage at her first book signing, surrounded by readers eager to hear her story, she knew one thing for certain. Sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the most unexpected opportunities. The memoir, Above the Clouds, quickly gained traction, spreading far beyond what she'd ever imagined. What started as a personal project became a movement of sorts, resonating with people from all walks of life. Readers weren't just drawn to the dramatic confrontation with the billionaire. They were captivated by her honesty, her vulnerability, and her courage to stand up for what she believed in, even when it cost her dearly. As word of the book spread, media requests poured, and at first she hesitated. Facing cameras and microphones again felt daunting, especially after the scrutiny she'd endured during the initial incident. But something inside her shifted. This wasn't about defending herself anymore. It was about sharing a message that mattered. So she agreed to interviews one by one, each time stepping into the spotlight with a little more confidence than before. One afternoon, she sat down for an interview with a popular morning show. The host greeted her warmly, introducing her as the flight attendant who stood up to power. The audience erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the studio. For a moment, she felt overwhelmed, not by nerves, but by gratitude. These were strangers, yet they seemed to understand her story on a deeply human level. "Let's talk about that day," the host said, leaning forward. "What went through your mind when you realized you were kicking off someone so influential?" She smiled faintly, recalling the whirlwind of emotions. "Honestly, I didn't think about who he was at the time. My focus was on doing my job, making sure everyone followed the rules because those rules exist for a reason. It's not just about convenience, it's about safety and fairness. But later, when I found out who he was and how much sway he Had it hit me. I knew there would be consequences. The host nodded thoughtfully. And there were. You lost your job over this. Looking back, do you regret your decision? Her answer came without hesitation. No, I don't regret standing up for what I believe is right. Would I have handled certain things differently? Maybe. Hindsight is always 20/20. But at the end of the day, I couldn't live with myself if I let fear dictate my actions. Sometimes, you have to choose integrity over comfort, even if it's hard. The audience erupted in applause again, many nodding along as if her words struck a chord deep within them. She glanced around, taking in their faces, young and old, men and women, people from all backgrounds, and felt a surge of hope. Her story wasn't unique, but it was universal. Everyone had faced moments where they had to decide between standing firm or backing down. And here she was, proof that choosing the harder path could lead to growth even if it came at a cost. After the interview aired, the response was overwhelming. Social media lit up with messages of support, people sharing their own experiences of standing up to authority or privilege. Some confessed they'd walked away from jobs or relationships rather than compromise their values. Others admitted they wished they'd been braver in similar situations. Her story became a catalyst for conversations about fairness, accountability, and the imbalance of power in everyday life. But fame brought its own challenges. Not everyone celebrated her decision. Critics argued that she should have prioritized diplomacy over confrontation, suggesting she could have found a middle ground without causing such a scene. A few online trolls accused her of seeking attention, claiming her memoir was nothing more than a cash grab. Reading those comments stung, but she refused to let them define her. Instead, she focused on the positive impact her story was having, reminding herself why she'd chosen to share it in the first place. Around this time, she received an invitation that caught her off guard. A speaking engagement at a leadership conference. Organizers praised her courage and asked if she'd be willing to address attendees about ethics in the workplace. At first, she doubted whether she was qualified to speak on such a topic. After all, she wasn't a CEO or a motivational guru, she was just someone who'd made a tough call. But then she realized that maybe that was exactly why her perspective mattered. She wasn't speaking from a position of authority. She was speaking as a person who'd lived through the consequences of standing up for her principles. Standing. On stage that day, she felt a mix of excitement and nerves. Hundreds of eyes stared back at her, waiting for wisdom, guidance, or inspiration. She took a deep breath and began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. When I think about ethics in the workplace, she said, I think about choices. Every day, we're faced with decisions, big and small, that test our values. Do we stay silent when we see something unfair? Or do we speak up? Do we follow orders blindly? Or do we question whether those orders align with what's right? These aren't easy questions, and the answers often come with risks. But I truly believe that every time we choose integrity, we create ripples. Even if we can't see them right away, those ripples matter. The room fell silent as she spoke, her words hanging in the air like a challenge to everyone present. When she finished, the crowd rose to their feet, applauding long and loud. People lined up afterward to thank her, some tearing up as they shared their own struggles with ethical dilemmas. One man approached her, his voice trembling. Your story reminded me that it's okay to take a stand, even if it feels like the world is against you, he said. Thank you for being brave enough to share it. Moments like these reaffirmed her decision to step into the public eye. Yes, it was scary, and yes, it came with criticism, but the connections she forged, the lives she touched, it made everything worth it. Slowly but surely, she began to see her ordeal not as a failure, but as a turning point. Losing her job hadn't ended her career. It had redirected it towards something greater. As months passed, opportunities continued to unfold. She partnered with advocacy groups focused on workers' rights, using her platform to amplify voices often overlooked in discussions about power dynamics. She joined panels discussing corporate accountability, sharing insights from her experience while learning from others. And she kept writing, not just about her past, but about the lessons she hoped others could take away from it. Through it all, she remained grounded, leaning on the support of friends, family, and the growing community of readers who'd embraced her journey. They reminded her that she wasn't alone, that countless people understood what it meant to fight for fairness in an unfair world. That sense of connection fueled her determination to keep going, to keep pushing for change no matter how incremental it might seem. Yet, amidst the newfound purpose and fulfillment, she couldn't help but reflect on the irony of it all. Kicking off a billionaire passenger had cost her stability, security, and the life she'd known. But it had also given her something invaluable, a chance to redefine herself, to find meaning in adversity, and to inspire others to do the same. Life, she realized, had a way of balancing loss with unexpected gifts, if you were willing to look for them. As she closed another chapter of her life, she felt a quiet sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but she was ready for whatever came next. After all, she'd already proven to herself that she could face storms and rise above them. The whirlwind of attention and opportunities began to settle into a rhythm, but the flight attendant, now an advocate, author, and speaker, knew her journey wasn't just about riding the wave of fame. It was about creating lasting change, even if it meant taking smaller steps than the ones that had brought her here. She often reminded herself of something she'd written in Above the Clouds. Real progress doesn't happen overnight. It's built brick by brick, choice by choice. Her days were now filled with a mix of speaking engagements, writing projects, and advocacy work. Each morning, she woke up with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Gone were the rigid schedules of early flights and late nights at the airport. Instead, her calendar was packed with events where people gathered to hear her story, not because it was sensational, but because it resonated deeply with their own struggles. One particular event stood out: a workshop for young professionals, navigating workplace challenges. The room buzzed with energy as attendees introduced themselves, sharing snippets of their lives and careers. Many spoke of feeling stuck between doing what was right and playing along to get ahead. Their stories mirrored hers in ways that made her heart ache, but also gave her hope. If she could help even one person find the courage to stand up for themselves, she thought, then every moment of this new chapter would be worth it. She opened the session by recounting the infamous flight incident, not to relive the drama, but to highlight the lessons she'd learned. When I decided to enforce the rules that day, she said, I didn't think about the fallout. All I knew was that I couldn't ignore my principles. Looking back, I realize how important it is to trust your instincts, even when they lead you down a difficult path. Afterward, she broke the group into smaller discussions, encouraging them to share their own experiences of standing up or hesitating to do so. One woman recounted being pressured to falsify reports at her job. Another talked about confronting discriminatory behavior in her office. Each story added layers to the conversation, showing how universal these dilemmas truly were. As the workshop wrapped up, a young man approached her, his hands shoved nervously into his pockets. I've been in a situation like yours, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But I backed down because I was scared of losing everything. Hearing you talk today, it makes me wonder if I should have fought harder. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. It's never too late to make a different choice, she told him. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about moving forward despite the fear. You'll face moments like this again, and maybe next time you'll feel stronger. That's growth. Moments like these reinforced why she continued pouring her energy into helping others, but it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were still critics who dismissed her message as naive or impractical. Some argued that standing up to power always came at too high a cost, questioning whether it was worth jeopardizing livelihoods for abstract ideals. Others accused her of romanticizing hardship, suggesting she'd benefited more from the controversy than she cared to admit. She didn't shy away from addressing these criticisms head-on. During a podcast interview, the host asked her directly, "Do you ever worry that your advice might set unrealistic expectations for people facing similar situations? Not everyone has the luxury of walking away like you did." Her response was measured but firm. "You're absolutely right. Not everyone can afford to walk away. And I'm not saying that's the solution for everyone. What I am saying is that we shouldn't let fear silence us completely. Even small acts of resistance matter. Speaking up in a meeting, reporting misconduct, refusing to go along with unethical practices, those things add up. Change starts with someone deciding they won't stay silent anymore. The comment section under the podcast episode exploded with reactions, ranging from heartfelt gratitude to sharp disagreement. But she didn't dwell on the negativity. Instead, she focused on the messages of support, particularly from those who said her words had inspired them to take action. Whether it was sending an anonymous tip to HR or finally leaving a toxic environment. Amidst the chaos of her evolving career, she found solace in reconnecting with old passions. Writing had always been a form of therapy for her, and she began exploring new creative outlets beyond her memoir. Short essays, poetry, and even sketches became part of her routine, allowing her to process emotions she hadn't fully unpacked during the height of her public emergence. These quiet moments of self-expression reminded her that while her story had touched thousands, it was ultimately hers to shape and nurture. One evening, as she sat on her balcony watching the sunset, she reflected on how far she'd come. Losing. Her job had felt like falling off a cliff, but instead of crashing, she'd discovered wings she didn't know she had. Her life looked nothing like it had before the incident, yet she wouldn't trade it for anything. For the first time, she felt aligned with her values, using her voice not just for herself but for others. Still, she couldn't shake the lingering question. What about him? The billionaire whose actions had set this entire chain of events in motion. Occasionally, she'd see headlines about his latest ventures or controversies, each one reinforcing the vast chasm between their worlds. Did he ever think about that day? Did it register as anything more than a minor inconvenience in his otherwise charmed existence? She didn't harbor resentment toward him, not anymore. In fact, she credited him, in a strange way, for pushing her onto this unexpected path. Without his arrogance and refusal to follow the rules, she might still be working the same job, living the same life, without ever realizing her potential to inspire others. He had unintentionally become the catalyst for her transformation. That realization led her to write a final essay for a magazine column titled, "To the Man Who Changed My Life." It wasn't accusatory or bitter. Instead, it was a reflection on how adversity shapes us. "I don't hate you," she wrote. "In fact, I owe you a debt of gratitude. You taught me that power doesn't define character, it reveals it. And though our encounter ended badly for me at the time, it forced me to confront my fears and embrace the unknown. So thank you for being exactly who you are and for unknowingly setting me free." The piece went viral almost instantly, sparking debates about accountability, forgiveness, and the complexities of human interactions. Some praised her maturity, while others questioned whether she was letting him off too easily. But she didn't write it for validation or approval. She wrote it for closure for herself. With that chapter closed, she turned her focus to the future. Advocacy work remained central to her mission, but she also dreamed of starting initiatives to support frontline workers facing similar ethical dilemmas. Maybe a foundation or a mentorship program, something tangible that could provide resources and guidance to those struggling to balance integrity with survival. As she drifted off to sleep that night, she smiled, imagining what might come next. The road ahead was uncertain, but she no longer feared the unknown. After all, she'd already proven to herself that sometimes the hardest choices lead to the most beautiful destinations. The months rolled on, and the flight attendant turned advocate began to see her dreams take shape in ways she'd only dared to imagine. Her idea for a foundation aimed at supporting frontline workers didn't stay just an idea for long. With the help of friends, former colleagues, and even some unexpected allies who had been inspired by her story, she started laying the groundwork for what would become Wings of Integrity, a nonprofit dedicated to empowering employees in high-pressure industries. The name itself carried deep meaning for her. Wings symbolized freedom, the kind she'd found after leaving behind the confines of her old life. And integrity stood for the values she believed everyone deserved to uphold without fear of retribution. Together, the two words captured the essence of her mission, giving people the tools and confidence they needed to navigate ethical challenges while staying true to themselves. Launching the foundation wasn't easy. Fundraising was a daunting task, especially since she was still rebuilding her financial stability after losing her job. But she approached it with the same determination that had carried her through the toughest moments of her journey. She reached out to organizations aligned with her cause, pitched her vision to potential donors, and leveraged her growing platform to spread awareness. Slowly but surely, the pieces fell into place. One of the first programs under Wings of Integrity was a mentorship initiative pairing seasoned professionals with younger workers navigating complex workplace dynamics. These mentors weren't just there to offer advice. They were there to listen, to validate, and to remind mentees that they weren't alone. For many participants, having someone who understood their struggles made all the difference. She also spearheaded workshops, similar to the ones she'd led earlier, but this time tailored specifically for industries like aviation, healthcare, and hospitality. These fields often demanded long hours, strict hierarchies, and unwavering compliance, leaving little room for questioning authority. Through interactive sessions, role-playing exercises, and open discussions, she encouraged workers to think critically about their roles and responsibilities, not just as employees but as individuals with voices worth hearing. Word of Wings of Integrity spread quickly, drawing attention from media outlets and advocacy groups alike. One publication dubbed her the accidental activist, highlighting how one bold decision had snowballed into a movement. The title made her laugh. It was accurate, after all. Activism hadn't been part of her plan when she woke up on that fateful morning years ago. Yet here she was, leading a charge for fairness and accountability across industries. As the foundation gained traction, she received invitations to speak at conferences around the world. Each trip felt surreal, especially when she boarded planes, again, not as a crew member, but as a passenger heading to share her story. Sitting in those seats brought back memories of her days as a flight attendant, reminding her of how far she'd come. Sometimes she'd strike up conversations with fellow travelers curious about her work. Their questions and reflections reinforced her belief that change started with connection, person to person, story to story. But perhaps the most rewarding aspect of her new life was seeing the impact of her efforts firsthand. One day during a workshop in a bustling city, a young hotel worker approached her after the session ended. Tears streamed down his face as he thanked her for creating a space where he could talk openly about the pressure he faced daily. "I thought I was the only one feeling this way," he said. "Knowing there's a community out there fighting for us, it means everything." Moments like these reminded her why she kept pushing forward, even when exhaustion threatened to pull her under. Building something meaningful required sacrifice, patience, and resilience, but every grateful smile or heartfelt message fueled her determination to keep going. Still, she remained acutely aware of the challenges ahead. Power imbalances weren't going away anytime soon, and standing up to authority still came with risks. Some workers feared retaliation if they spoke out, while others doubted whether their voices would even be heard. She knew her foundation couldn't solve every problem overnight, but she also knew that progress was possible, one step at a time. Her own life continued to evolve alongside her work. Writing remained a cornerstone of her routine, offering both solace and clarity. She published a second book. This one focused not on her personal experiences, but on practical strategies for fostering integrity in the workplace. It became a resource for leaders, managers, and employees alike, further cementing her reputation as a voice of reason in turbulent times. And then, unexpectedly, another chapter opened. A letter arrived from someone whose identity shocked her. It was brief, handwritten, and unsigned, but the tone unmistakably belonged to the billionaire entrepreneur who had once dominated headlines alongside her. "Your essay gave me pause," it read. "I don't expect forgiveness, nor do I deserve it. But I want you to know your words made me reflect on my actions, not just that day, but throughout my life. Perhaps there's value in recognizing our flaws, even if we can't undo them. Thank you for teaching me something I didn't realize. I needed to learn. She stared at the note for a long time, emotions swirling inside her. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as insincere, a PR move designed to polish his image. But another part, a quieter, more hopeful part, wondered if maybe, just maybe, her story had touched him in a way she hadn't anticipated. Whether or not the apology was genuine didn't matter as much as the fact that her message had reached someone so different from herself. In the end, she tucked the letter away, choosing not to dwell on it. What mattered most was the ripple effect her journey had created. The countless lives touched, the conversations sparked, the courage ignited. She didn't need validation from anyone, not even him. Her purpose was clear, and her path stretched, ahead full of possibilities. Years later, when asked about her legacy, she smiled softly. I don't think about legacies, she said. I think about moments. Moments where someone decides to stand up, speak out, or simply believe in themselves a little more. If my story helps create those moments for others, then I've done what I set out to do. And with that, she walked away. Not toward fame or fortune, but toward the next challenge, the next connection, the next chance to make a difference. Because for her, the sky was no longer the limit. It was just the beginning.